Playing video games or using your phone to browse social media is probably not a problem for you. In fact, I have no doubt you could sit in front of a screen and accomplish both of those tasks for 2 hours or even more without losing your concentration. But what about studying for 30 minutes? Well, that could be too difficult. Would you mind investing a little more time in your side project? That doesn't seem very nice. You know logically that studying, working out, starting a business, or doing anything else equally productive will benefit you more in the long term, yet you still choose to watch TV, play video games, and browse social media. It may be argued that the reason is evident. One activity is easy and doesn't require much effort, while the other activity is difficult and it requires you to apply yourself. However, other people appear to have no trouble regularly working on their side projects, studying, or working out. Which raises the question, why do some people have greater motivation to take on challenging tasks? And is there a way to simplify challenging tasks? We must examine the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain in order to provide an answer to this problem. Many people think of dopamine as a pleasure hormone. That's not exactly what it does, though. It's dopamine that drives our cravings. And we are motivated to get up and do things by that desire. I'll show you some rat experiments that neuroscientists conducted to demonstrate the effectiveness of dopamine if you have any doubts. The rats' brains were implanted with electrodes by the researchers. The researchers activated the rat's brain reward system each time it pulled a lever. As a result, the rats experienced intense cravings that kept them pulling the lever repeatedly for hours on end. The rats would not even go to sleep or eat. They would just keep pressing the lever until they would drop from exhaustion. But then the process was reversed. The reward center of the brain's dopamine release was inhibited by the researchers. As a result, rats became so lethargic that even getting up to get a drink of water was not worth the effort. They had no hunger at all, wouldn't eat, and didn't want to mate. You could say that the rats lost all will to live. The rats would still eat and enjoy the food, though if it was placed right in front of them. They just didn't have the motivation to get up and do it themselves. One might assume that our need for food and water is driven by hunger or thirst. Dopamine also plays an important part in this. While those rat experiments may be extreme, you can see similar effects of dopamine in people and our daily lives. Your brain sets priorities mostly based on how much dopamine it thinks it will get. If an activity gives off too little dopamine, you won't feel much motivation to do it. On the other hand, if an activity gives off a lot of dopamine, you will want to do it again and again. So, which activities cause dopamine release? Any activity where you think there's a reward will release it. If there are no rewards, it won't be released. For instance, before you eat comfort food, your brain releases dopamine because you expect that the food will make you feel good, even if it actually makes you feel worse. Your brain doesn't care if the activity that raises dopamine is harmful. It just wants more of it. A typical example is a drug addict. They know that what they are doing is bad for them, but all they want is to get more of that drug. Cocaine and heroin, besides giving you a high release huge amounts of dopamine, which makes you crave them even more. It is worth noting that nearly everything releases some amount of dopamine. Even drinking water when you feel thirsty does. However, the largest dopamine release occurs when you get a reward unexpectedly. A common example is playing a slot machine at a casino. Even if you have been losing money until that point, you still expect to win a bigger reward at some time. You just don't know when it will happen. In our modern digital world, we are constantly bombarding our brains with high levels of dopamine each day, often without realizing it. Examples of activities that provide a strong dopamine release include scrolling through social media, playing video games, and watching online adult content. We look forward to some kind of reward from each of these actions. That's why we keep checking our phones. We expect to see a text message or other notification, and we know that eventually we will get it. We are starting to act like rats pulling a lever to get a new hit of dopamine. You might think, so what? It is not harming me. But that is not true. Our bodies have a biological system called homeostasis, which means that our body tries to keep physical and chemical conditions balanced. When something is out of balance, our body adjusts to it. For example, when it's cold outside, our body temperature decreases. As a result, we start shivering to create heat and warm up our bodies. However, when it is hot outside, our body temperature increases and we begin to sweat to cool down. Essentially, our body aims to maintain a temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius or 98 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter the conditions. But homeostasis can also show up in another way, through tolerance. For instance, someone who rarely drinks alcohol will get drunk quickly. In contrast, someone who drinks regularly will need to consume more alcohol because their body has built a tolerance. It takes more alcohol to feel drunk since they have become less sensitive to its effects. This concept applies to dopamine as well. Your body tries to maintain homeostasis by lowering the number of dopamine receptors. Essentially, your brain gets used to having high levels of dopamine and those levels become your new normal. As a result, you develop a dopamine tolerance. This can create a big problem because activities that don't release as much dopamine become less interesting. Therefore, it becomes much harder to motivate yourself to engage in those activities. They can feel dull and less enjoyable because they don't release as much dopamine compared to activities that do. That's why many people prefer playing video games or browsing the internet over studying or working on their businesses. Video games provide a sense of comfort and happiness since they release high levels of dopamine. Unfortunately, activities like working hard or reading tend to release less dopamine. This is one reason why drug addicts face such difficulty when trying to adjust to a normal life after quitting. Their dopamine tolerance becomes so high that everyday activities cannot compete. They become like the rats from earlier studies, lacking motivation to do anything when there is insufficient dopamine release. This issue isn't exclusive to drug addicts. Those addicted to video games, social media, or internet pornography face similar challenges. Once their dopamine tolerance is elevated, they find it hard to enjoy activities that provide lower dopamine levels. This raises the question, can anything be done to prevent this from happening? The answer is that you should consider performing a dopamine detox. By now, you may have an idea of what a dopamine detox involves. You will designate a day to avoid all highly stimulating activities. You will stop bombarding your brain with high levels of dopamine, allowing your dopamine receptors to recover properly. Just a note, if you struggle with drug addiction, it's essential to seek professional help since you may have developed a physical and psychological dependence. I want to ensure you do not face severe withdrawal symptoms during this process. Returning to the detox for one entire day, aim to have minimal fun. Avoid using the internet or any technology like your phone or computer. You will not listen to music, engage in sexual activities, or eat junk food. Essentially, you will eliminate all sources of external pleasure for the entire day and fully embrace boredom. And believe me, you will experience a lot of boredom. However, you are allowed to do the following. Go for a walk, meditate, reflect on your life and goals, and write down any ideas that come to mind on paper instead of your computer or phone. This might seem extreme, but if you desire significant results quickly, you need to take bold action. Now, you might wonder why this would work for you. Consider it this way. If you've been enjoying every meal at the best restaurant in your area, those fancy meals quickly become your new standard. If someone then offers you a bowl of plain rice, you would likely decline because it wouldn't taste as good as what you're used to eating. But if you suddenly find yourself stranded on a deserted island and starving, that bowl of plain rice starts to look quite appealing. That's the primary purpose of a dopamine detox. It deprives you of the pleasures you typically enjoy, making those less exciting activities seem more appealing again. In simple terms, a dopamine detox works because you become so bored that boring activities eventually become enjoyable once more. Your brain has been experiencing abnormally high levels of dopamine, therefore you want to give your dopamine receptors time to recover. Additionally, boredom will motivate you to take on other tasks throughout the day. Things that you would normally put off because they don't release as much dopamine. It's also easier for you to complete them because you're bored. Of course, it's a good idea to occasionally stop from high dopamine activities. However, it's best to stay clear of those actions completely, or at the very least, minimize them. Rather, you should associate dopamine with more of the things that will truly benefit you. And what I found is that your current high dopamine activities can serve as an incentive to pursue things that actually give you those long-term benefits. Your brain has been experiencing abnormally high levels of dopamine, so you want to give your dopamine receptors time to heal. Additionally, boredom will motivate you to take on other tasks for the day, things you would typically put off since they don't cause as much dopamine to be released. It's also easier for you to complete them because you're bored. Of course, avoiding high dopamine behavior once in a while is good. But ideally you should avoid those behaviors altogether, or at least as much as possible. Rather, you should associate dopamine with more of the things that will genuinely help you. And what I discovered is that engaging in high dopamine activities now can act as a motivator to pursue activities that will in fact provide you with those long-term advantages. In other words, you could use your high dopamine activity as a reward for completing difficult work. And I personally carry out exactly this. I track all the difficult, low dopamine work I do. Cleaning my apartment, practicing the piano, reading books, doing some sort of exercise, creating these videos, etc. At the end of the day, I treat myself to some high dopamine activity after I reach a particular productivity goal. The key point is the importance of doing high dopamine activities after completing low dopamine tasks. If I start with high dopamine activities, I'll lose the motivation to tackle the harder, low dopamine tasks. That's why I always prioritize the difficult work first and save the rewarding activities for later. For example, after completing an hour of low dopamine work, I give myself a 15-minute reward of high dopamine activity at the end of the day. So, after 8 hours of focused work, I allow myself around 2 hours of more stimulating, rewarding activities. These are the ratios that work for me, but you can adjust them to fit your own needs. It's important to remember that if you're addicted to something harmful, you shouldn't use that as a reward. Instead, find a healthier alternative that still feels rewarding. As for my personal weakness, it's the internet. I can spend hours there without getting anything else done. That's why I use this system to manage my addiction. However, even with this system, I still schedule days where I avoid high dopamine activities entirely. In summary, it's possible to make challenging tasks feel easier, but if your brain is constantly flooded with dopamine, it becomes harder to stay motivated for less stimulating work. That's why limiting activities like phone and computer use or other high dopamine behaviors can help you stay focused. I can assure you it's absolutely worth it. If you're struggling with motivation, start detoxing your brain from excessive dopamine as soon as you can. Reduce your exposure to unnatural levels of dopamine, or at least limit how often you're exposed to it. Only then will everyday low dopamine activities start to feel enjoyable again, and you'll be able to focus on them for longer. We're all dopamine addicts to some degree, and that's not necessarily bad. Dopamine drives us to reach our goals and better ourselves. But it's up to you to choose where your dopamine comes from. Will you get it from unproductive habits or from working toward your long-term goals? The decision is yours. If you like this video, a gentle tap on the like button would mean a lot. It helps my channel grow since YouTube's algorithm shows content to a wider audience based on engagement, allowing more people to improve their lives. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope this video made you a little better than yesterday.